Welcome back, everyone. We made it to week two, and we've got this week and then 13 more after that, if you don't count finals week. But who's counting? That's all I got to say. Most everybody in this room, because we're accounting majors. That was a pun. All right, but yeah. So I had a couple things I wanted to announce before we get to topics today. So first thing that came up, so a little bit of background. I told you a little bit about this last Monday, but I tried to make sure that all the first day complete actions were done for text print, and it looks like that I was not effective in that regard because a few people did still get online resources. If you're in that boat, I think that I've got the problem figured out, and basically it has to do with McGraw-Hill Connect, which again, I think that they've got good resources. They just don't always have good explanations for how to use those resources. So I put a link up here, and if you click on this link, Connect Access, it should take you to Connect, and it will actually launch to a quote unquote assignment in Connect. All right. Now, I want to make sure everybody is clear on this. There are no assignments in Connect. I had to complete this just so people could get access to Connect and they can access to the textbook. But this is the way to get Connect access. If you don't have a login directly through Connect, you can click on this and you should be able to log in through the Brightspace portal. Uh, if you are in Connect, and apparently there are a few of you who are in Connect, you do not need to worry about completing this assignment. This is not a real assignment. This is just a way to get Connect access, because through everything that I tried to do to get this connection to work, I couldn't actually just make general Connect access to whereas you just click on it and you go to the front page of Connect. I don't know why that's not the case. I've tried it multiple times, so that's how I have to set it up. Um, from what I understand, when we did this last fall, I didn't teach this course in the spring, but when we did this last fall, everybody but a few people were able to get access through Connect. And if you are able to do it through Connect, great. I think we got the problem solved. You should be able to have access to your textbook. The Connect access is mostly just so you have access to the text. If you are not able to access Connect through that link, please come talk to me and we'll see if we can get it resolved. Again, I'm working with certain resources here that are limited. I do have access to my McGraw-Hill personnel, but they're kind of limited in the scope of what they can do. And the bookstore is Barnes and Noble, so they don't really have knowledge about the technical support here. So I will do everything I can to get it out and get you access to it. If you don't have access, let me know. It's obviously really important that you have access to the book because you need access to the problems for homework that we're going to be doing on Friday. So yeah, just as a little update for that. That's all you really need the access to the Connect for, is just to make sure you have access to the book so that you can so you can answer the homework and do the reading as necessary. With respect to what we're doing this week, we're obviously going to be lecturing today, talking about chapter 4. Then on Wednesday, the entire class session is set aside for NetSuite. We're going to go through it pretty slow. It is going to be a little bit of a tedious process getting things set up. That's by design. You notice I talk really fast, but I slow way down when we get to NetSuite, and I repeat myself multiple times. So this is intended for a couple purposes. One, to make sure everybody can keep pace with me. Secondly, so you can take diligent notes while we're going through NetSuite. So if you're not in the habit of taking notes, I suggest that you change that process for this particular activity because you will be tested on the NetSuite material. Specifically, the stuff that I've emphasized very heavily, saying, what is the purpose of this? Why do we do this? Because it relates to the bigger picture of what we're going to be doing in this course. The first stuff should be pretty straightforward. It's basically setup stuff, but there are some really important procedures and protocols that we have to walk through. Then on Friday, we're going to do a little bit of a change from pattern. We're going to do our first Excel assignment on Friday, but then we'll do homework on Friday rather than our first AIS assignment. We'll get into our routine more closely starting in week 3, and then we'll immediately disrupt this routine in week 4 because Labor Day is going to occur. But we will get into a fairly constant routine after week 4, but it's a little bit dicey because we will need to have the entire class period for NetSuite on Wednesday. All right, with that, let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to be talking about today. So again, just as a repetition, the material that we're going to be talking about here is not necessarily the most interesting or engaging material. You'll hear me with a caveat at the end of the lecture where I'll say, if you did find this material interesting and a little bit upside, but for the large part, this is necessary content, but it's not necessarily fun content because we're going to be talking about documentation of business analysis processes. That's what we're going to be talking about over the next 2 lectures. We're going to do this one and then we're going to do another one. And so it's important to kind of preface this with some theory that sets the stage for what we're going to be doing. So Let's start out with talking about the role of accounting in business. And this is really, really important for everybody, regardless of whether you're an accounting major or you're a business administration major. What is going to be the importance of this? And the answer is there's a lot going on here. Remember, we had that picture last week of the accountants with the bean counters, and I said that was kind of the common vernacular. The whole goal of accounting back then was literally just the last part of that word, counting. All right. When you talk about counting, obviously there's that emphasis on that last part is just adding enough numbers together and make sure they matched. And the whole role has evolved over time. And it's become so paramount with having a good understanding, good rapport of the need for understanding of accounting that it's been defined as the language of business. In fact, I've got a series of quotes from Warren Buffett. Does everybody know who Warren Buffett is, by the way? Yeah, it's like multi-billionaire or kind of the founders and chair. I think he's not the chair anymore, but he used to be the chair of Berkshire Hathaway, who was a big, large conglomerate of organizations. Very, very well-known businessman and investor. And one of his 10 rules of business is that you have to learn accounting. It is the language of business. And that was a statement for everyone, not just people in business. Okay, that was a statement for everyone. I do think that we suffer, particularly in the United States, from a lack of financial literacy and a lack of knowledge of basic concepts. It's really important for everybody to have at least a requisite working knowledge. It's important for everybody in this room to have an expert level of knowledge. So what are some things that we're going to be doing with accounting? And there's a lot going on there. There's regulatory compliance, which we talked about compliance a little bit last week. We said those are the laws and regulations in which an industry operates. So having a knowledge of that and how that fits. Obviously, taxes is a big important accounting concept. I will say that if you hear the term accounting, people will say, oh, so you do taxes 9 times out of 10 if they don't know what you're talking about. There's actually a joke about that. A former professor emailed me out of the blue last night and was asking tax questions, which if you don't know anything about me, that's really funny because I am useless when it comes to tax. I am just pointless. Stakeholder assurance, which is kind of the financial aspects that we talked about. What is the purpose of preparing those financial statements is to be able to provide some sort of assurance to the outside individuals who rely on this information. Then we have investor relations, which are a group of that stakeholders. By the way, stakeholders and shareholders, are those the same thing? They sure sound like the same thing. So shareholders are a group of stakeholders, but that's not entirely true, entirely the entire group. So shareholders are owners of an organization. Those are investors. But stakeholders are anybody who has an interest in the organization. So stakeholders encompasses a larger, broad array of individuals. So if I said who's a stakeholder, I would say owners, like shareholders. I'd say creditors. So those would be the owner groups. But also, could customers be a stakeholder? They have an interest. Yeah. What about employees? Those could also be stakeholders as well. So it's important to make that distinction. Financing, raising capital and loans is important, reporting to the board, and then statutory reporting, which aligns really closely with the regulatory compliance we talked about earlier. So a lot of things that accountants do and accounting information systems aggregates all that detail that's going to be together. And that goes with respect to multiple different aspects of the organization, whether that be operational or whether that be business management support. So kind of strategic decision making as far as that goes. Now, with respect to that, we need to be able to understand how do we process documentation that's important for reporting and decision making in these areas. And we need to establish a hierarchy for that. So let's talk about the hierarchy. So we're going to start with this idea of business processes. Now, a business process is just simply defined as a defined sequence of business activities that use resources to achieve business goals. All right. Business processes are kind of the lifeblood of an organization. If you don't have clearly well-defined business processes, then you're not going to be able to make money and you're not going to be able to stay in business. Now, what do I mean by a business process? We're going to talk about 3 business process sequences really in this course. There's far, far more than that, but we're going to talk about 3 distinct ones. So the first part is going to be the revenue process. Can we all agree that generating revenue is important for most organizations? Not all. Some organizations can exist without revenue, usually not for profits. But even then, it's kind of really, really fuzzy as to whether or not what they're doing is revenue generation or not. They still have to actually generate some sort of thing to maintain the support. So if we're going to generate revenues, it probably also makes sense that we're going to also have procurement. We're going to have to buy things that help us generate revenues. Walmart would not be in business very long if they bought products one time, sold out, and said, yep, we're done. We're all sold out. You can still give us money, but we have nothing to sell you. So procurement or purchasing is really important. And then we're also going to be talking about inventory management, which is going to reflect back on what you learned in 221. Now, anything that kind of falls within those compartments could be defined as a business process. And for those of you lucky enough to join me in 417, we'll expand upon that and talk about more business process areas in that course as well. but anything that's got that sequence of business activities that generate business or that achieve business goals can be defined as a business process. So we're going to use business analysis to define these business process requirements and evaluate potential improvement. So in order to be able to understand whether a business process is operating effectively and doing what they need to do, we need to be able to establish some sort of business analysis technique. That is where we're going to develop a business model as an abstract representation of business process. And that model is going to allow us to generate documentation to explain how business processes and systems operate. So you can kind of see how the hierarchy works. We establish, first of all, what a process is. What is the goal of the process? Then we're going to analyze that process. We're going to simplify it to a basic model, and then we're going to use some sort of depiction to determine how that business process model operates. Now, that is the kind of where we were trying to get to, because the question then comes, okay, what type of documentation do we use? And the answer is we've got multiple different approaches. We're going to talk about one approach today, and we're going to talk about the second approach next Monday. So what are the approaches that we need to talk about? The answer is activity models and structure models. Now, we're going to loosely define activity models as the human-centric perspective on business processes. In other words, if I were to show you a business process and say, how do you define it? You would use an activity model to explain this in kind of human vernacular, how you would view this particular process, how you would view this, how you would define it. Yes. Yes, good question. And we're actually going to get to that here in just a little bit. That exact thing, a flowchart. Exactly. Yeah. So how would we depict this as a human being is interpreting what's happening in the process? So something like a flowchart's a good example of that. The second area of this is going to be structure models. Okay, structure models are going to be very similar in concept, but a lot different in application. A structure model is simply how a program, an automated process like a computer, would evaluate these processes. So it's more of like looking at about how the system itself defines the process and the protocols that it needs to walk through. Now, is there a relationship between these two? Yes, but by and large, we're going to depict them separately. All right, we're going to look at the same process areas and depict them through separate views, through separate lenses. So today we're going to be talking about activity models, and then we're going to be talking about on Monday structure models. Now you will notice also here that these are going to be defined by business rules. Business rules are really important because these set the infrastructure for how we actually depict these flows and set constraints on them. And we've already talked about the nature of these constraints. We've used the term controls. All right, so controls will be very, very relevant and important as we move forward. So let's talk about some basic purposes of documentation. So documentation of process and system is necessary for the proper function of any organization, which I've never made a more general statement at any point in my life than that, okay? I could have said the sky is blue and the grass is green, and it probably wouldn't have been out more meaning. So what are some specific purposes, though, that documentation serve? And the answers are, first, promote organizational efficiency, which is optimizing production and service with minimal inputs. Now, the question is, if you could generate a recipe, if you go home and you're going to generate dinner and you have a choice of a meal and the flavor would taste exactly the same, but you could use 5 ingredients or 50 ingredients, which are you naturally going to choose? Probably the 5 ingredients, unless you just hate yourself and want to spend hours at the kitchen and say, I'm going to use 50 ingredients because I'm just that complex. Probably going to be going for the 5 ingredient meal, which is why those like 2 ingredient bread dough type things are always so popular with people who want to do cooking and baking. It's very difficult to mess up. And efficiency is really important because the less moving parts you have, the less chance there is you're going to make a mistake. So efficiency, very, very important. But if it's naturally going to have efficiency, then we probably also need to talk about effectiveness, which is going to be make sure that we actually accomplish our goal. So efficiency and effectiveness are related, but efficiency is basically saying we want to have the minimal amount of problems that could occur, minimal amount of inputs. And this is basically saying we want to focus on the outputs, making sure we get the actual result. Do these relate to one another? Yes, but they're not the same thing. All right. They're not the same objective. There's a couple of others that we need to also talk about. Proper design and operation of internal controls. So I've talked and alluded about to internal controls. And by the way, just as a note, you will get sick of me talking about internal controls in this course for a couple of reasons. First, we're going to be talking about them a lot, probably in multiple times over the course of these next few weeks. Sometimes they'll be in chapters back to back to back. We will have an entire chapter just dedicated to the discussion of internal controls. Secondly, it's probably my favorite thing to talk about across all my courses. All right. I used to be a detractor of internal controls, saying it's pointless to understand the theory. And then I kind of got it. And then I said, oh, these are actually pretty darn cool. So we're going to define controls a little bit more in detail a little bit later on. But for right now, we need to understand internal controls are necessary because they reduce risk associated with these particular operations. These are required under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Is everybody familiar with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002? I know this is like 24 years ago. And you're just like, it's before my time, Dr. Barnes, which first of all, ouch. And secondly, it's still relevant and important because it's in operation today for publicly traded companies in the United States. So if you don't know the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, you might want to take a look at that, not necessarily specifically for this course, just for your general well-being of being a business major, aspiring career business person. Then finally, we have compliance with relevant laws and regulations. And I defined this earlier, but I'm going to redefine it again. This is making sure that they follow the relevant rules that are related to the business environment. Usually these change from industry to industry. It really depends on the volatility within a certain industry, such as, for example, the rules and regulations within the aerospace industry are really, really well defined, and they have to follow those, but they're different from those in the financial sector. So we need to understand what the rules are and how we actually generate information based on those specific rules. What are some additional things that we need to consider with respect to documentation? Well, we also need to know how it relates to employee training. People cannot do their job effectively if they're not trained well and they don't know what their responsibilities are. Then we have audit requirements. Audit requirements, as you probably heard in previous courses, relates to the financial statement audit or any compliance or operational audits that relates to operation or the operations of an organization. So these are people who come from outside the organization and scrutinize the work that you're doing and try to make sure that it's consistent with the expected standards. There's also accountability. You will be held accountable for the decisions that you make and the information that you provide. So you have to actually make sure you meet all the objectives. Then there's external communication, which is basically the same thing you learned back in Accounting 220. That's reporting to outside shareholders and creditors. That's those financial statements that you've learned how to create and learned how to analyze and learn to love, hopefully. And then there's internal communication, which is what you learned in Accounting 221. Those are the operations within the organization as far as they relate to decision-making with accounting details. And then I had some empty space, so I just put a picture of here, Dr. Caden saying, never trust an auditor, which I think that's pretty much a direct quote from Dr. Caden, but yeah. I was trying to be dismissive, but let's be honest, it's Dr. Caden. It's Dr. Caden. She's the one who would say that. So now we're on to the point of documentation. And what are some documentation types that we can talk about? Well, there's one of two categories. The first category is personally my favorite. These are narrative descriptions. All right. I operate very well with narrative descriptions. I'm not a visual person. I tend to think that I'd like to analyze information. That being said, I'm in the minority. I'm the 5%, whereas 95% of the people on the planet operate with visual depictions of information and systems. And it makes sense, as much as I hate to say it, it makes sense to be able to operate that way because it's much easier to see a grand design when you can see how that grand design naturally flows. So we have graphical representation. Now we're going to talk about the first three at a very minute level of detail, but these are ones that have evolved over time. It used to be block diagrams, which were really basic. It was just rectangles right next to each other indicating different processes. Then it evolved into data flow diagrams. From there, we started getting into flow charts were mentioned. And then we're going to be talking about business process model documentation. That's going to be different ones such as business process maps, IDF 0, and the one that's bolded and italicized over on the far right is BPMN, Business Process Model Notation, which will be our default form of our documentation for this course with respect to activity models. So just as a little bit of a spoiler, we're going to have two diagramming methods that we will learn in this course specifically. The first one we're going to learn today is business process model notation. Although we'll talk about all of these, you'll be responsible for knowing BPMN for your exam. And then next week, we're going to be talking about unified modeling language, UML diagrams. And I've already made an allusion to UML diagrams. Students hate UML diagrams. I am aware. If you tell me you hate UML diagrams in the evaluation, trust me, you won't be the first person to tell me that. Do I think that they're really, really boring and tedious? Yes. Do I think they're really important? I also yes. So yes. So it's going to be one of our two defaults. UML and BPMN are default. So BPMN is an activity diagramming method. UML is a structure diagramming method. All right, so let's talk about these first few because these are still going to be important. We need to understand why we have to go about this, like what this represents. So as technology has evolved, process and system adaptation has changed to match pace. So why is that the case? Why have we had to increase the rigor of these documentation methods? Well, let's consider the following. I've got three different tools here to use. So I've got an iPad, got an IBM, I don't remember what the model of this I used to, so IBM PC 5150 from 1983, and then the Columbia punch card computer from 1969. All right. Now I'm going to ask you two different questions. So the first question is, if I were to make you build one of these devices, you had to, this is your project for AIS, you had to build. First of all, many of you would probably say, well, I'm not doing that, dropping the course, okay? Yeah, it's like get an accounting professor with a more reasonable expectation. But if I were to get you to build one of these machines, which one would be the easiest one for you to build as far as a matter of speaking? What's that? The punch card computer, yeah, okay. It's simplest design, simplest in operation, okay? So that's pretty straightforward, which means that the process diagram when we need to operate it is really, really important. So there's really, it's an onus on the user to be able to understand how it operates. But what happens if I say I want you to be able to use one of these? Which would be the simplest one to use? Probably the iPad. It's by design supposed to be easier to use. So let's think about the nature of those. As we've evolved over time, the onus of being able to operate these systems has moved from the user to the administrator. Now, creating an iPad is probably a very tedious task. It's probably very difficult. The engineering and design behind it, well beyond my level of expertise. But using it's very easy, which that's kind of true for most accounting information systems. As accounting information systems have become easier for users to be able to utilize, but they're more complex to administer and to be able to operate effectively. Which means that if that's the case, we need good documentation to understand and define the processes that are used. Using the machine itself, very, very easy. Designing the system which can be utilized for those machines, much more complex. So that's why we've got more complex diagramming tools at our disposal now, which hopefully makes the people who are utilizing these tools, their lives much easier. So narrative depictions. Narrative depictions are those written ones that I personally like. It's a written depiction of the component systems and flows and process within the system. The good news is these are very detailed and focused. Through words, you can tell any story that you want to tell, and you can give any level of detail that you want. Problem is, they're very hard to follow. It's probably very easy for you to set a picture in your mind when you're reading something like fiction or when you're reading very, very light nonfiction. If you're reading accounting terminology, it's very, very challenging. It's very hard to see what that depiction looks like. So the thing about these tools is they're generally not standalone. With respect to narrative diagrams, or sorry, narrative descriptions, they generally do not stand on their own very well. I'm not going to hand you this and say, here's the description of our system. You're going to say, okay, can I get a visual depiction? So these are usually used in unison with graphical representations. And I think that that's an accurate way to sum the particular narrative descriptions. They can be used as a support tool for explaining what happens within these graphical representations, but very, very regularly, they will not be good enough to stand on their own. All right. Now, we talked about several different types. Let's talk about these few and talk about them in order. So first of all, block diagrams. This is a basic graphical representation of an accounting system and its subsystems. This is about as complicated as it gets with a block diagram. It says, what are the parts of the revenue process? There's sales order processing, shipping, accounts receivable, and then parts of the accounts receivable is customer invoicing and cash receipts. This is something that if I asked you to create back in 220, you probably could do that because you had a requisite knowledge of the understanding, a very basic knowledge of this. This is as complex as systems get, not even close, but it does do a good job of kind of showing the bare shell of a system as it operates. This would have been appropriate back in the 1960s, maybe 1970s for depicting systems because the computer tools utilized for those systems were not really well defined and are very highly utilized. But as we started evolving, we started using more computerized tools, we needed better depictions of the system. So we're going to evolve into data flow diagrams. It's a more detailed graphical representation of system that shows movement, storage, flows of data in system. So instead of just rectangles now, we have rectangle and multiple symbols. So we've got the rectangle or square, which basically represents an entity. And then we got a separation with the circle and a process. By the way, this is just for informational purposes. I will not test you on what these symbols represent here. Like I said, you're responsible for BPMN diagrams and UML diagrams, all right? And then their data stores is kind of an open box, and then data flows, which if used properly can give you a much better depiction of what the overall system operates and looks like. So we can kind of see here, we've got multiple entities within the system, the process that relates all these entities, and an explanation of how these processes interact with one another, or this process interacts with the different entities. So if I were to say, which is a more valuable depiction of the operations of the system, would you say this one here or this one here? I left it on this one for a reason. This is a more valuable one, okay? It shows the interactions much more clearly rather than just kind of a general nature, just the general nature of the system. So yeah, as we talked about though, this is going to be a little bit old too. This is kind of a context diagram for a cash receipt system, and there's a lot more going on in modern cash receipt systems than just these processes and entities right here. So that's where we have the natural evolution to flowcharts. Now, I do want to make a note. I am not going to specifically test you on flowcharts except for one item that's going to be at the end, and I will point that out. So yeah, I do encourage you to make notes on these for your own benefit, because some older tools, especially those for private companies and smaller firms, they still use flowcharting as kind of their default mechanism for graphical depiction. But for the most part, it's become outdated. So flowcharting can still be useful, but it's not as important, prominent as it was back in the 80s and 90s. So it's a graphic system that shows what it does and how the system does it. It's frequently used by accountants, uses an if-then format. So if this thing happens, what's the follow-up after that? Shows what the processes are, not what they should be, and it actually has standards to govern them. So we actually have a lot of things can go in here, and you can kind of depict how old and outdated the flowcharts are because they have some things that are no longer commonplace. For example, magnetic tape storage. Does anybody know when magnetic tape storage was used? Back in the 70s and 80s. This is kind of the burgeoning of the evolution of flowcharts. Nowadays, we have much more efficient storage. We've also got paper document reporting. We assume that that's kind of the default. Most organizations don't even have paper reporting anymore. They still have documents, but these are usually electronic documents. That kind of tells you. But what does a flowchart look like? How does it actually represent these systems? Well, here's the same cash receipts process in a flowchart. Now compare this to what we were just looking at with respect to our data flow diagrams. We had 3 arrows, 3 entities, and 1 process. Can we say that this is a little bit more detailed? Just a tad. But the detail serves a very important purpose. It actually shows what are the processes, how do these processes interrelate, what are the decisions that you have to make with respect to these processes, and what are the steps that you have to walk through to take this information from inception to genesis, or not genesis, to determination, the ending part, whatever a word from ending is right now. So yeah, from basically the beginning to the end. Now, there's a lot of things going on in here, but I do want to point out 4 really important components of a flowchart. And this is the part that I will test you on in all likelihood, okay? So with respect to the data processing cycle and flowcharts, it consists of 4 primary steps. These are the 4 that you need to know for the exam, all right? So how do we capture information? That's going to be the data input, all right? This actually reflects back on what we talked about in our first lecture, that's one of the primary components of an information system is what are the inputs. So to be able to actually process anything through an information system, we have to know, how do we generate those inputs? Next, we need to understand what are we doing with these inputs? What are we processing them for? Why are we processing this information? And the answer is it's going to go to later stages within the information system. Also, we talked about timing differences last week, but remember, timing differences kind of accommodate storage. So if you're curious about what storage is for, the answer is it's basically saying if there's a timing difference between when an input is generated and when it's used, we have to have a mechanism for being able to hold that, be able to capture that. So storage accommodates timing differences. And then the eventual communication or output of that information, all right? So that's going to be the important 4th point is how do we take that information and how do we put it out in the world to where it's utilized. So information, processing, storage, and outputs. Now, know what those are and know what they represent within the system. It's going to be fairly straightforward vernacular. I'm not going to ask anything too complex on that. I would also know that in order to relate these steps to one another, they have to flow through the chart. That's why it's called a flow chart. So we need to know what the movement of those are. So if you look in the flow chart, you will see there are arrows that point the direction for different steps. These are called flows, predictably, because it's a flow chart. Now, flow charting symbols loosely comprehend the parts of the data processing cycle they relate to. Basically, what this means is that you look at a symbol, not a symbol, a symbol. It will tell you what is the purpose of that symbol by trying to explain what is happening in that step. We're going to see a lot of correlation here with respect to a business process diagram. We're definitely going to see rectangles. We're definitely going to see diamonds. And these are kind of the same thing that they represent within the flowcharting system, is that if something that looks like a document represents document information flow. A diamond represents a gateway where we move from one step to the next. And we can depict those through a much more simplified process, but a unified process in a BPMN diagram. But again, this is your primary thing that you need to know for this particular part of the flow chart. Understand these 4 steps as well as the 5th kind of hidden one, and understand what they represent within a flow charting diagram. Now, again, we're not going to do flow charting. My guess is that you may have done flow charting in other courses, may have some familiarity with that. I do think it's a valid perspective, but there's a certain problem with flow charts that comes up. And one of the big problems with flow charting is that it's a little bit, first of all, it's a little bit dated with through the symbol terminology, which you could say, what if we just update the symbols? There's a problem with that, is that first of all, the symbols themselves, even though they're dated, if we tried to update them, we would literally have hundreds, if not thousands of symbols that could be used because there's so many different mechanisms in place in modern society. So implementing new symbols for flowcharts is not going to solve our problem. It's just going to make things more complicated. And what our goal is here is to have a comprehensive depiction of a system without all the complication. So what we need to do is take a step back and say, how do we simplify these steps without losing any explanatory power? And that's basically what we're going to do with a BPMN diagram. So the good news is for BPMN diagrams, these are going to be a little bit more simplified with respect to symbol nomenclature. That's what I'm trying to say, and I'm speaking too fast. Symbol nomenclature, and that we're going to have fewer symbols that we have to use, but they're going to represent a greater volume of information within the system and the surrounding components. So let's talk really quickly about the symbols themselves and what BPMN diagrams, and then I'll explain what I mean by that. So business process model and notation, first edition adopted in 2004, so relatively recent. I say relative, again, many of you may say, I wasn't born in 2004, and I'm going to say ouch again. All right, but maintained by some group called the Object Management Group, which we're going to see that term again because they also manage UML diagrams. It represents an upgrade to traditional flowcharting and encompasses more complex and modern business processes and systems, which is kind of an interesting term, interesting to say that, because as I just alluded to, BPMN diagrams are more simple in approach, but they represent a greater array of information, a greater array of detail that can be depicted by an actual flowchart. So the actual depictions themselves are more simple, but the information they depict is much wider in context. And we generally use specialized modeling software for this. That being said, on the first exam, will I have you create a BPMN diagram? In all likelihood. So you will have to know how to draw these out. You will have to know how to create one. That being said, the ones that we're going to look at are going to be pretty straightforward. Don't worry too much about the components of the BPMN diagram today. We will revisit this when we get to our process chapters, revenues, procurement, and inventory. We'll actually have specialized BPMN diagrams for each of those processes. So we're just going to look at the components today and how these components interrelate. You may have to create some for your homework, but it should be pretty straightforward. So the first thing we need to know is the symbol for events. And basically it's the same symbol, but it has 3 representations. So events include start, intermediate, and end events. So starting event obviously starts any activity system. We have intermediate steps. If there's an event that occurs during the process or during the activity, then we need to be able to depict that. And then an end event is just as it sounds. This stops the system. This stops the activity. So intermediate events can affect the flow of the process, but never start or end a process. So they always occur somewhere in the middle of that. So I'm guessing right now that we can all depict a symbol in 3 different shapes. Is everybody comfortable with this particular one? So this is basically the important one. And obviously, every single diagram we create should have at least 2 of these symbols, should have a starting symbol and an ending symbol. Now, I want to make a quick note of that. I'm going to throw you some caveats out there. You may see some BPMN diagrams that do not have an ending process or an ending symbol. I do think that's an oversight. I do think all BPMN diagrams should have an ending symbol, and I will hold you to that in the exam, though you may see some examples in the book that don't always hold to that convention. Then we have activities. Activities represent specific steps in the business process. Basic activities are modeled as rounded rectangles, all right? So each activity is described with a short verb phrase, hopefully better than do something, okay? But they depict something that's taking place. An activity is just as it sounds, a rounded rectangle. Now, if you draw a square rectangle on the exam, I will not count off for that, just so you know, okay? Just something that looks like a rectangle is an activity process. Then our third primary symbol is going to be a flow. Just that same line we saw in the flow chart is a sequence flow. Now these flows can move in multiple directions. They don't always have to move from right or from to the right. We will be drawing right to the left, or left to right, excuse me. left to right. So we will start on the left and move to the right, but we may have flows that occur from top to bottom. We'll explain why that's the case here in just a second. And then we have gateways. Now, gateways are kind of unique, and gateways basically show branching and merging of the process as the result of decisions. These appear in pairs on the diagram. They show the first one shows the branching, the second one shows the merging. That's the way it should be, and I think that any good BPMN diagram will always have a pair of gateways. We'll have the first one that opens the process and a second one that closes the process. Again, we may see examples of this in the book that don't always follow that convention, but if we're doing it for by hand, if we're doing it for this course, then I want you always to make sure that you have an opening gateway and a closing gateway. Now let's talk really quickly about the nature of some of the gateways. Okay, so we have something called an exclusive gateway, where only one path can be taken on the gateway for each instance of a process. Or we have an inclusive gateway, which basically says that multiple paths can be taken out of gateway. For the most part, we will not look at examples that have inclusive gateways. It will be a one or the other choice, usually, sometimes three choices, but it will always be one of those choices, the path you take. You will very rarely have the option of taking multiple paths simultaneously. I'm not going to say never, but to my knowledge, we will never look at that in this course. Then we have parallel gateways, which basically says all paths are taken out of the gateway. This will never come up, but I do think it's important to note because you may see examples of that outside of this course. Also, let's take a look at the examples of exclusive gateway so you can kind of see planning a trip. We can reserve a flight or reserve a rental car. We're never going to do both of those. At least that's what the exclusive gateway tells us. You may make an argument that says, what if I take the flight and then I get a car after I get off my flight? I'm saying that's defeating the point of this discussion right here. We're assuming that you're either going to take a flight or you're going to take a car. That's kind of the whole goal of the exclusive gateway. The parallel gateway is basically saying that it flies. What I was saying before is that we're going to have a flight, a rental car, or you're going to get a flight, then a rental car. So both of those are options. Then the parallel gateway says basically you will have to do all three simultaneously. You need a hotel, you need a flight, and you need a rental car, and you'll do all three of these steps. You will do all these steps. Not necessarily that's important to note. These steps will take place simultaneously. You won't necessarily do the activity simultaneously. Like riding in a rental car is probably going to be very difficult while you're riding in an airplane. This is more about the reservation activity and not the actual follow-up activity itself. So here's a simple example of BPMN diagram, and this is kind of one that you should lean on to. One, because this is going to be representative of the type of examples we'll look at in this course. Secondly, this would be a good resource for you to use when you do your homework for Chapter 4. So let's talk really quickly about what it is that we do for BPMN diagrams. So we scan items and identify payment methods. So we're going to the grocery store and buying groceries. So we're assuming that you're either scanning them yourself or somebody's going to be standing them for you. I prefer the latter because I remember when grocery stores used to always have checkers that did that, and I was not the checker. And I'm going to get on a rant if I don't stop right now because I tend to rant about that. But anyway, we'll probably hear that come from me in the future. So you scan the items and identify your payment method. You have two possible payment methods. You can pay by credit card or you can accept by cash. You won't do both and not in these situations. So you have a gateway decision. Are you going to do one or the other? And you choose your choice, and then you actually do the processing through whatever that is, whether that be providing the credit card or putting cash into the system. That closes the branch because, again, as we said, whenever you have a decision, you have an opening gateway and a closing gateway, and then you bag your items and you leave the store. So this is kind of a simple example of going to processing payment for the items that you buy at the grocery store. Could we expand this out a little bit? Could we add items before the start or here? We could move the starting gateway back and say you could enter the store, you could go down the aisles and pick up your goods. That's all possibilities. We could expand this diagram out to encompass additional activities, but this is a good, simple, unified example of what we would be doing for a BPMN diagram for a simple process. All right. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the concept of pools and lanes. So the previous example is restricted to a single area of an organization. In practice, processes and systems overlap areas. So what does that mean? It means that in a real organization, most organizations, you're never going to have one process area the organization imparts. So a simple example for this. Remember we talked about Walmart, we talked about their generation of revenue process. What do they need to generate revenue? They need inventory, okay? What do you have to do with inventory? You have to think about it, and then it appears on the shelves, right? No, that's not being facetious, obviously. So they have to buy inventory. They have to purchase it. So they've got two separate processes that interact with one another, all right? They've got a revenue process, which is the sale of their inventory, and they've got a purchasing process or procurement process, which is buying the inventory. So let's assume that they need to go through both processes. Can we say that there's interaction between those two process areas? Yes, and that's why we've got the depiction here of pools and lanes. So what do these actually represent? What do pools and lanes represent? Well, you can kind of see the diagram below, like pools and lanes, and think about it this way, all right? Let's assume that you're in the same entity, but you've got different process areas. That's being in the same pool. You overlap different lanes. So revenue would be one lane, purchasing would be one lane, inventory would be one lane. These are all different processes within the same entity. Now, who does Walmart buy from? Do they buy from themselves? Sometimes. I mean, you could make an argument that maybe they buy from another store, but do they buy from external entities most of the time? So is it fair to say that this process, this procurement process, or these sales processes are going to interact with other entities as well? So we need to have separate pools because these represent individual entities, and these entities also have their own set of processes. So if we're trying to depict interactions that occur across entities, we need a separate pool. So the concept of pools and lanes is pretty straightforward. I went through it long and verbose, but let's just go ahead and simplify it. If we're talking about interactions between the same or interactions between processes within the same entity, we're looking at lanes. Okay, a lane is in one pool, and we're looking at how these processes go across different lanes. If we're looking at interactions across multiple entities, whether that's two or more, we have to look at separate pools. Separate pools are going to be different entities. So here's an example of how we would actually work within the same pool. So we've got one lane where we actually have a starting step and it moves over here. So say, for example, we've got a revenue process here. We say we don't have the merchandise that we need to sell to our customer. So we're going to go through a purchasing process here to get all those goods for the customer. Once the goods arrive, we can sell it to the customer. All right. So that's an example of revenue and purchasing working together in the same pool. But if we're talking about the interaction between between pools, let's see. Yeah, I don't have one for pools, but if we're talking about how we would sell this, then we would talk about there's probably a customer in a separate pool over here, and the sale would actually take place and send it to the customer out here. So a depiction of a second pool would actually talk about the generation of a sale to a separate entity. We could also have a different pool if we're talking about purchasing from a separate entity as well. So that's how we would depict separate pools. Now, again, this is kind of a basic depiction, but we'll talk about this more in detail as we look at specific BPMN diagrams for our process areas. Now, a couple of quick notes here. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Simple communication between departments or lanes as an organization is indicated by an unbroken line. But if we have an organization between pools, it's shown as a dashed line with an arrow and destination, a small circle on the source end. So basically, you see when we move between lanes here, it's a solid line, and all communication and all activity between those is going to be indicated by the line. If we had a separate pool, any interactions between the activities within separate entities would be denoted by a dashed line. So the same flow, but just a dashed line. So here's an example of that. Two different pools. So we have a doctor's office and a patient. The doctor's office is one entity, patient's a separate entity. Communications that occur here between these two entities are denoted by a dashed line. Here are some examples of other BPMN event types. By and large, you can ignore these for the time being. I would keep a close eye on these ones down here, these timer events, as well as error events, because these will come up in future diagrams, but these are just additional symbols to give context to complex operations that occur within a BPMN diagram. Now, to wrap this up, there's a few things I want to note here, all right? For system documentation, here's the bad news. These will continue to expand. Narrative and diagrams are not going anywhere. So if you're really, really bored right now, I'm sorry, okay? But this is something you're going to encounter in the real world, and you're going to have to know how to interpret, which is why we're getting this out of the way now. Also, regardless of your role, you'll be able to need to analyze narrative and diagrams. So there are a lot of you are accountants in this room. Some of you are going to be marketing, management majors, and finance. If you're going to have any interaction with internal operations or external operations of an organization, which is to say every one of you, you do need to understand how these activities operate. But I do have good news. I do have some good news. The good news is, as documentation has become more detailed, the tools to develop documentation have evolved. As I said before, we're going to be doing handwritten depictions of BPMN diagrams. That's not the way it works in the real world. In the real world, you have specialists who can develop these diagrams. You may even become one of those. which is my final piece of good news. If you were just sitting here today and you were just in rapt contemplation of everything I was saying, this is something I want to do in the future, you've got a really good career ahead of you. Okay. You're going to be one of those people that's going to be in high demand because this is something that's really, really challenging, but very, very necessary. All right. That's it. I'll see you for NetSuite 1 on Wednesday.
I think